thank you for the opportunity to present my take on making qualitative data fair here today in the FAIR Coffee Lecture. I will argue that in order to make FAIR relevant for qualitative social science research, we need to add an I to the acronym in order to emphasize that we need to impart FAIR data to other researchers, students, and research participants in order to fulfill its full potential. But before I go into moving from FAIR to FAIRI, I will first of all guide you through a research project on which I reinterpreted the FAIR principle for qualitative research. Then I will tell you why I care about FAIR interviews and focus group data. So that's the kind of data that I collected in my research project. And finally, I'll talk about moving from FAIR to FAIRI, the importance of imparting FAIR data to others. But let me start with an overview of my research project. And please bear with me because there will be quite some details which are not so important in order to understand how I applied the FAIR acronym or the FAIR principles to my data. But I still would like to give you an overview of what my research is about so that you better understand the context on which the data was collected. So first of all, a little bit about my background and the field of research in which I work. So I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, where I do my PhD research in science and technology studies, which is also known as the sociology of science. So basically, I study the social and ethical aspects of scientific research as it plays out on a day-to-day basis, usually in laboratories or other technoscientific spaces. And more specifically, I also try to be active and to intervene in these processes to basically contribute to ethical and responsible research, which is also known as responsible research and innovation, not only in academic field, but also a policy program, which is all about widening the horizon of ethical considerations in science and technology development. So this is the background against which I conceived a research project together with my collaborator Eric Fisher from Arizona State University, which is entitled Leveraging Integrative Capacities, Cultivating Hybrid Role Identities Through Steer-Practitioner Dialogues in Contemplative Science. And maybe in order to understand what that project is about, let me give you a little bit of background of my research. So the scientific community that I study are contemplative scientists. These are usually neuroscientists or psychologists who study contemplative practices such as mindfulness meditation by drawing on behavioral measurements, but also neurophysiological correlates or psychological tasks. And what is very particular about this group of research is that they often perceive a tension between their scientific and their contemplative selves, especially within the structural constraints of the neoliberal academy. So you can imagine that on the one hand, as these contemplative scientists are also often long-term contemplative practitioners and adhere to a Buddhist value system, that there is quite a clash between what is often valued in mindfulness, such as being in the present, having a compassionate attitude, and the often elbow-like culture that currently exists in academia, where it's all about working at a fast pace and being productive and future-oriented. So for many contemplative scientists, especially, due to their, in a way, what we would call a hybrid role identity, being both a contemplative practitioner and a scientific researcher, they struggle with this tension. And so they struggle with integrating also contemplative values in their scientific practice. And as I noticed this struggle, I wanted to have a look at the capacities of contemplative scientists to preserve their contemplative science identity through socio-technical integration, which is any activity whereby technical experts take into account the societal dimensions of their work as an integral part of that work. And societal is here a very broad term, which encompasses not only social, ethical, environmental, or economic considerations, but also contemplative dimensions, which are very important for the group of researchers that I worked with. And in order to study their capacity to preserve their contemplative science identity, me and my collaborator conducted 2 online workshops with in total 25 contemplative scientists, during which we asked them to engage in practitioner dialogues guided by the protocol of socio-technical integration research. What this is about, I will tell you in a minute, but it's all about mapping decision-making processes in relation to technoscientific work practices as they play out on a day-to-day basis. And the idea is that when looking at specific decision-making processes, then we can actually map all the dimensions that actually play into this decision-making process, the different considerations, including contemplative values, and in that way to gain a better understanding of how these values actually play a role in decision-making processes. Then after these workshops, I conducted follow-up interviews with participants about their experience of the dialogues in the week following the workshops that we organized. And in this way, I tried to answer the following research questions. How do contemplative researchers enact and experience various forms of socio-technical integration? How do guided practitioner dialogues shape these integrative activities, and which conditions enable integration, and how are they related to the STEER methodology? For the sake of this presentation, I will now not go into the results of the research project, but rather tell you a little bit more about the STEER method so that you understand what kind of data we collected. So the STEER method seeks to study and enhance socio-ethical reflection and practice in technoscience. It is based on a decision protocol that you see here on the screen on the right side. Basically, usually it's as a social scientist working together with a natural scientist, and they both complete this decision-making grid by asking what is an opportunity for decision-making, which kinds of considerations play a role when trying to make this decision. Are there alternative courses of action that we can explore? And what are the possible outcomes when putting one of these alternatives into practice? So in that sense, you see it is a reflection exercise that has helped by now over 70 organizations worldwide to gain a better understanding of the societal values that play a role in their technoscientific practices. And as I mentioned before, usually these so-called STEER dialogues are conducted by a social scientist who is embedded in a technoscientific space and interacts on a regular basis with technoscientific practitioners. But what we try to do is actually move away from interdisciplinary collaboration and towards practitioner dialogues. So basically, we gave contemplative scientists the exercise to map a decision protocol together and collaborate among each other, so to say, in order to gain a better understanding of the contemplative values in their work. And we did so during the workshops, as I already mentioned. Here you see the structure of the workshop. So basically, you see that there were 2 practitioner dialogues taking place, so that both participants in a pair could actually have the chance to map their own decision-making process. And then you see that the interviews that were conducted in the subsequent week after the workshop were quite extensive, lasting 45 to 90 minutes, in order to really get a first-person understanding also of how these people experienced these practitioner dialogues, the carriers and barriers in the interactions. But yeah, as I mentioned before, if you're interested in the results of our study, feel free to contact me. I will now focus on the data that we collected during the workshops. And these were, first of all, audio recordings of the workshops themselves, the STEER practitioner dialogues and interviews, as well as their pseudonymized transcripts. In addition, we also asked participants to complete these STEER decision-making grids, which we then also transcribed and pseudonymized. So there was quite a range of data that was collected. And now the question is, how was this data made fair? So let me briefly go through the different principles and let me reinterpret them in the context of my qualitative research project. So first of all, I think that the F for findable is pretty similar in qualitative research as it is in quantitative research. So I made my data findable by publishing it on dataverse.nl. Please note that the DOI here is not a mock DOI. It does exist, but my data wasn't published yet because the article that relates to that data set is still under review. And as soon as that is accepted for publication, the article will be published together with the DOI that you see here on the screen. Then secondly, to make my data accessible, I was thinking a lot about what kind of permission I would like to give people to access it. So I decided not to make it completely free of access because to some extent the data that I collected is sensitive. It is sensitive not in the sense that people are really identifiable, as I mentioned. It's pseudonymized, but at the same time, you can imagine that contemplative scientists know their colleagues, and it is also stated in what kind of context I organized the workshop, and people might be able to identify which colleague participated based upon the data. So I wasn't comfortable with just giving out the data for download, even though I got the permission from participants to do them. So So basically, before conducting the workshop, they all received informed consent forms in which they also agreed to make the data available for other social scientists or other researchers who would like to work with the data for non-commercial purposes. But despite that permission, I decided that I would like to discuss the intended use in a personal consultation with the people who are interested in accessing the data. Also because I think that this allows me to basically not only have an oversight of how the data is used, but also to brainstorm together with potential reusers of the data how it would make sense to reuse it. And I think that this collaborative aspect of it could be very inspiring both for me and also for the other person. So that's why accessibility was really something I was thinking through and decided to restrict it based upon personal consultation. Then for interoperability, I think that is a relatively unproblematic aspect of my research. So basically, the data is stored as a PDF or Word file, so that should be usable by most people. And then last but not least, the reusability of my data largely depends on the data documentation. So in order to make the data reusable, of course, I need to explain to others how my data was collected, what kind of data is missing, what are the premises of the research, what kind of interview topic guide I used. And this basically means that I drafted a data documentation that gives much more information about my methodology, the data collection process, and also the processing of the data than could ever be included in a journal article. And that's the data documentation that you see here that is uploaded together with the data on dataverse.nl. And you see also that part of the data documentation is also a description of the files, a description, as I already mentioned, of what kind of data is possibly missing and why, and also an overview of the background of the participants of the workshops, as you see here. And again, I think especially for qualitative research, data documentation is very important because usually as a qualitative researcher, we are ourselves the instruments of the data collection process, of the data generation. And that means that there is a lot of flexibility and a lot of know-how, I would say, hidden in the data generation process that I try to make explicit in the data documentation. And in this way, I hope that it would allow other researchers to actually reuse the data for their own purposes or also to reproduce the study that I conducted. So now you see I made a lot of effort to make my data fair. And I was asking myself, why I should care about FAIR principles in the first place. I have to admit here that I was made aware of the possibility to make my data fair by my data steward at FaSoS, Maria Romero, and she said, you already pay quite some money on student assistance, or that's at least what I also intended to do when writing a funding application. And she said, wouldn't it be great to make all these transcripts of the workshops, accessible for others? And I was writing the funding application, and I was thinking, yeah, why not? Probably this makes quite a good impression. Open science is quite important at the moment, so probably this will get me some brownie points in writing the funding proposal. And so with that thought in mind, I remember how I participated in the first Fair Coffee lecture in January, which was given by my colleague from FaSoS, Leah Bayerman, where she presented how FAIR or open science principles could be made relevant for the humanities, and where she suggested that we should maybe rethink these principles from the ground and rather try to reconceptualize open humanities instead of applying open science principles one-to-one. But yeah, besides her lecture, you see here a comment that I posted back then in the discussion of the lecture. So I posted in the Zoom chat, thanks for the answers on open access publication fees. I have another concern about open humanities. I feel that making humanities data open access is something that got me brownie points in a funding application, but might not actually help other researchers. I assume it will be difficult for them to reuse my focus group and interview data, because the data collection process has been part of its analysis. So you see here how I was skeptical about the relevance of FAIR for my research, which also induced me to reflect more about why FAIR could be relevant. And by now, I'm actually convinced that maybe we can make the world a better place, one brownie at a time. So why do I now care about FAIR? I think there are 3 points that make me care about FAIR that I would like to present to you today. FAIR data for transparency and accountability, FAIR data for future research, and FAIR data for teaching. Let me start with FAIR data for transparency and accountability. And that is something that is very important for my research community. So as I already mentioned before, I worked with socio-technical integration research, also abbreviated as the STEER method. And the STEER method has been used, as I mentioned before, in more than 70 laboratories or other techno-scientific institutions across the world. And in that sense, there's really a community of STEER researchers that have been commenting on and critiquing each other's work. And you see here 3 common critiques that are often raised in relation to STEER research. And I think that FAIR data could actually help us respond to these critiques. So the first one is that we see what we look for. So basically, the main research question that is often asked about the STEER protocol is to what extent it actually enhances and helps researchers to take into consideration a wider horizon of societal values in their day-to-day techno-scientific practice. So it's really an evaluation of the effects of the STEER method. And what has been raised in an article by Thoreau is that basically, if we want to see or if we want to find that the STEER methodology indeed helps scientists to make more socially conscious decisions, then we will also find exactly that. So basically, we can, redefine the term societal in ways that helps us actually see that STEER has these effects that we desire. And I think that making data fair would actually help us to make that claim more convincingly, because we could directly guide people to the data and say, look for yourself whether you agree with what I see in the data. And based upon that, we have much more informed discussions about what is in the data and how this is analyzed and interpreted. A second point refers to value advocacy. So the STEER method is usually defined as a tool to open up reflexive spaces in which researchers bring the values to the table that matter to them. The person who guides the steer decision exercise is usually somebody who asks probing questions, but who does not advocate for specific values to be taken into account. And the ethos of doing steer also says that whenever the steer researcher oversteps that boundary and actually makes a suggestion to take a specific value into account, then this should be noted down in any data documentation and also in research articles. And still, although this ethos of steer exists, often people critique the method for implicitly introducing values into science. So basically taking on the role as a value advocate rather than a reflexive partner, so to say. And again, I would say it's easier to hold steer researchers accountable for such practices and also for complying with the ethos of steer if the data, the transcripts of the steer exercises are actually visible and accessible for other steer researchers to basically look for themselves if value advocacy took place or not. And the last point refers here to how steer research is communicated to research participants. So one of the critiques of the steer methodology was that often it results in constructing knowledge behind the backs of those we're studying. And that's the case because you might have already noticed steer is relatively difficult to understand because it involves quite some social science jargon, and especially when talking about it with natural scientists who are not used to reflect upon the ethical and societal dimension of their work, it might come across as a little bit inaccessible and not easily comprehensible. And that's also why often a steer study is conducted without the scientists necessarily being completely aware of what they're getting themselves into. And I would argue that, again, making steer data available gives us another basis for communicating to research informants what we're actually doing in steer studies. So in a way, FAIR data also enhances the ethical interactions with our research participants. My second reason for why FAIR data matters is that FAIR data could actually be used in future research. So I think one could reproduce our study design in other communities, and that's mainly possible because our data documentation is so in detail, so that actually the methodology is very visible and could be, as I mentioned, conducted again, reproduced in other scientific fields. Then secondly, I would find it interesting to see if FAIR data could be integrated with data collected in other steer studies so that in the end one would have much more data to analyze and could possibly make more overarching and stronger claims. And last but not least, that's something that I find particularly interesting, is that FAIR data allows other researchers to possibly reanalyze the transcripts of interviews and practitioner dialogues with another theoretical framework. So usually when we conduct a steer study, the theoretical framework that goes with it is called midstream modulation. So we look at to what extent the steer method helped researchers reflect on the values that are part of their research practices. And possibly when analyzing the data through, let's say, a framework that focuses more on strategies for decision making, one could see something entirely different than what we analyzed. And that's something I would find very interesting to see what other researchers could possibly do with this data and really see other results, have other findings guided by their conceptual lens. And last but not least, I think FAIR data is very relevant for teaching purposes. So the STEER method has been taught around the world in STEER workshops, for instance, at ASU by Eric Fischer, who developed the method, but also here in the Netherlands at the University of Twente. And I myself have given STEER workshops here at the University College in Maastricht, but also in Denmark at the Interacting Mind Center. And one problem that I encountered when teaching STEER, that it's often very difficult to make students comprehend how to analyze STEER data. And the main problem is that I basically do not have data that I could analyze with them together, or that they could have a look at to get an understanding of how STEER data could be coded, for instance. And I don't have that data available because from my own STEER study that I did in 2018 in a neuroscience laboratory in France, I do not have the permission to just share that data because, it is considered to be sensitive. And I think that, when we implement FAIR in our data management from the start and get consent to actually share the data with others, then, we suddenly have this material for teaching. And I'm quite sure that this is actually in the STEER community the first time that there is now FAIR data available for teaching purposes. And this will not only facilitate my own teaching, but also that of other STEER researchers who would like to share data with students in order to practice its analysis. So, and now, last but not least, I will come to how we should move from FAIR to FAIRI, adding an I to the acronym for making data impartable, for imparting it to other researchers, students, and informants. I think that the I for impartable is very important for qualitative research, because we cannot expect that people are aware of our FAIR data if it is simply published on Dataverse. So I think as a FAIR researcher, or as a FAIRI, as I call it here, we need to make sure that our researchers' data is known to other researchers, to students and informants. We need to actively use it in teaching. We need to actively send it to our research informants. And importantly, we also need to actively talk to other researchers and brainstorm with them together how FAIR data could be used. And this is something that I actually would like to discuss further and also brainstorm further about for my own purposes, because in the upcoming year, I hope to be able to organize workshops in which I bring together STEER researchers in order to reflect together on possibilities for reproducing my study, for reanalyzing the data through other lenses, for integrating my data with other data sets, and just to see what's actually possible with FAIR. And I think that this is really part of being a FAIRI researcher, is really to actively communicate and transmit the existence of our FAIR data, so that in fact it is ultimately reused by others for future research. And this is already my last point. If you would like to continue talking about how to move from FAIR to FAIRI, feel free to contact me. Also, if you're interested in the results of the research project that I presented. Finally, I would just like to thank the FAIR Coffee Lecture Series again to invite me to talk about how to make FAIR relevant for qualitative social science research. Thank you.
Want to learn more about the open science movement and FAIR? Find our next events below.